good afternoon, and depending from where you're joining us, possibly good evening. My name is Mareike Ohlberg. I am a senior fellow in the Asia program of the German Marshall Fund. And on behalf of the German Marshall Fund, I would like to welcome all of you to this book talk with Dr. Luke Patey on his latest book, How China Loses: The Pushback Against Chinese Global Ambitions. Dr. Luke Patey is a senior researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies and lead senior research fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies at Oxford University. He has been published in newspapers such as the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Guardian, the Hindu, Foreign Affairs, and Foreign Policy, and has also previously written a book called The New Kings of Crude: China, India, and the Global Struggle for Oil in Sudan and South Sudan. But of course, today we're here to talk about a different book that has a very timely title, How China Loses, that is based on his extensive travels in East Africa, Latin America, Europe, and Asia, and basically looks at how in the era of U.S. China strategic competition that is heating up, how actually the rest of the world figures into this whole picture, and concludes that, of course, the rest of the world still matters, and it's important to look at how it is dealing with this competition and how it's pushing back against Chinese ambition in some places. Now, of course, Luke, your book couldn't be more timely. We have, in fact, seen quite a bit of backlash against the Chinese government and its ambition. We've seen, wolf warriors going all out in France, spreading some disinformation, and France actually pushing back quite forcefully. We have seen sanctions from the European Union against individuals and an institution from Xinjiang, and of course, very angry counter sanctions that may or may not backfire on China. And just today, I think we've heard that Lithuania is actually leaving 17+1, making it 16+1. So I think we couldn't have a better time to be talking about your excellent book. Now, before we get started, just a couple of points on housekeeping, just for everybody's information. This talk is on the record. We're not live, but we are recording it, and we'll publish this talk later on our website. I would like for everybody, if you have questions that you want to ask Luke Patey, you can ask them through the Q&A function. You can, during the talk, you can start submitting your questions, and I will try to get to as many of you as possible. But before we get to this discussion part, I want to hand the floor to Luke to introduce the basic ideas from your book and to get us started. Luke, over to you. I think you're still muted. You need to, I think you have to still unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. All right. I hope my slides are visible there.
We can now see the whole slide. I think you just had the presenter's view.
Yes. Okay, sorry about that.
There we go.
Okay, well, thanks for having me today. I appreciate the German Marshall Fund arranging the event. And what I want to do in 20 minutes or so is briefly discuss the motivation behind the book, and then unpack several stereotypes that I think limit our understanding on China's global power and influence in the world. So the book really came out of a fascination with seeing China's growing global presence in the places I traveled, but at the same time, a frustration with seeing images in major publications that depicted China's rise as a contest between it and the United States, this U.S. China rivalry, and gave off the impression that as China challenged the U.S. and moved towards surpassing the U.S. in economic and maybe even military power, that in turn it would come to dominate the future of global affairs, of the global economy. And what I tried to do in the book is to put a spotlight on China's relations with some other major countries and other major regions in the world. And what I found was that China was facing significant new risks and challenges to its rising power, and even eliciting global pushback from some major powers. So rather than the U.S. China rivalry alone determining the extent of China's global influence, it's its relations with developing countries in Africa and Latin America, but also its relations with advanced economies in Europe and in Asia that matter. Now, we shouldn't doubt that China is not a significant power. It is. It is, by many measures, already an economic superpower. It has vaulting military strength, rising technological prowess. But at the same time, I don't think we're heading to a future where China will be in charge of global affairs. Rather, I argue that the decisions that China's leadership has taken, particularly over the last decade, have come to undermine its rise in global affairs. Now, this doesn't mean that America will return as the dominant global power, but it is to say that China's behavior matters, and its relationship with the rest of the world is significant in dictating its trajectory. So there's no better place to start in gauging China's global influence than looking at its global project, the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, the Belt and Road Initiative is Xi Jinping's foreign policy signature. It aspires to harness hundreds of billions of dollars in finance to build transport, communication, energy infrastructure, but also to lay the ground for new industrial corridors, manufacturing investments, spread Chinese technology standards, and increase China's political and cultural cooperation across Euro-Asia, but also along the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Now, in the US, in Europe, in India, the Belt and Road is often framed as a question of whether it's a debt trap or is simply just business. The debt trap idea sees the Belt and Road as China's way to intentionally and deliberately ensnare partner countries in high levels of debt in order to then capture strategic assets when countries can't pay back these loans. And the just business idea is one that sees China's initiatives and infrastructure and technology projects as purely or largely oriented by business interests, by commercial interests, and not really many strategic ambitions. But I think what will really dictate and determine the success of the Belt and Road will be whether it can produce sustainable development outcomes for its partner countries. And this is something President Xi Jinping has stated when promoting the Belt and Road at the 2018 Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. He called on African countries to step on the express train to China's development. And Beijing wants the Belt and Road to legitimize its political and economic model in the world, but it also has economic ambitions behind the Belt and Road. It would like it to offshore some of the overcapacity that China has built up in heavy industries, in construction, for example, and also to help extend the reach of Chinese companies across the world. But there are inherent contradictions between these political and economic goals behind the Belt and Road, because this engagement typically doesn't focus on building development success in its partner countries. And I'll mention a few reasons why very briefly. First, the projects from the outset are Chinese dominated. So we often hear the story that China has no political strings attached to its development assistance, to its loans, but it has many economic strings attached. And these demand that loans are used to hire Chinese contractors, and projects are built by primarily Chinese exports. So 89% of projects examined by one study were Chinese contractors. So from the get-go, local industries are crowded out by the development of infrastructure projects, for example. Secondly, certainly developing countries in Africa and across Asia need infrastructure. There's a tremendous gap in these regions for new roads and railways and hydropower dams. This is something that China can provide, that others can provide too. But not any infrastructure at any cost will do. Infrastructure needs really to generate new productive economic activity. New railways need to help export goods from local economies, not just bring in Chinese goods, as we see in several examples in East Africa. And countries in the Belt and Road tend to have lower borrowing capacities, and therefore really have to make extremely smart decisions on how they borrow funds for infrastructure. So China's engagement may not be a debt trap. We may not be able to find intention behind the funds it offers, the loans it offers others. But Belt and Road projects can incentivize misspending and corruption by local elites. Finally, I'll mention one more point on the Belt and Road, and that's that we're not seeing a large offshoring of Chinese manufacturing investment and the creation of millions of new jobs, as some scholars indicated during the early years of the Belt and Road. So Chinese manufacturers are largely staying at home. They're automating rather than going out to developing countries. There are, of course, cases of Chinese companies going abroad, but most of them go to Southeast Asia. And in Africa, for example, Ethiopia is often seen as a significant case, but across Africa, of course, that the attention is not there. So in order for this infrastructure to really become productive, the investments need to be there, and this is not taking place very broadly. Another point on the Belt and Road before moving on is that we're seeing this significant drop in infrastructure finance of late. And the idea here is that other major powers who want to shape international development norms, they shouldn't necessarily sit on the sidelines just because we see these falling levels. China has indicated it wants to expand the Belt and Road into a digital health focus, and therefore countries such as the U.S., countries in Europe, India should get involved in and become more involved in developing countries and offering and meeting some of their needs. And I think, though broadly speaking, most developing countries are looking at a diverse level of cooperation. They're not simply interested in putting all their eggs in a Chinese basket nor an American basket, and that they're not necessarily interested in taking on anyone else's model, but are developing their own moving forward. Another relationship I examine in the book is that of Europe's with China. And over the last couple of decades, Europe's trade and investment with China has grown quite dramatically. But this has also created concerns that China is wielding new political influence in Europe. And this picture depicts Sarah Berthau, a Danish woman who was involved in a demonstration, a Tibet demonstration here in Copenhagen in 2012. And Danish police stopped Sarah from demonstrating, and also detained or blocked around 100 Danish citizens involved in protests throughout the city that day, when Chinese President Hu Jintao was visiting to sign some pretty significant business deals. And this created the idea, at least for Sarah and other protesters, that economic interests for the Danish government trumped political values. These questions are still being asked in Europe, particularly towards the new EU-China investment deal, the provisional deal that was signed late last year, and questions remain on whether China will commit to the pledges it's made to ratifying international labor conventions considering forced labor underway in Xinjiang region. So this value versus interest debate is significant. We should pay attention to it. We should consider the pros and cons. But in the book, I also try to unpack another question, and that's scrutinizing the economic interest side of this equation and how significant China is for Europe. Because in recent years, we've seen Europe become more attuned to the competitiveness that it faces with Chinese industry and Chinese corporations. And this came through, I think, for three reasons. Firstly, over the last couple of decades, we've seen an increase in Chinese investment within the EU to a degree that it surpassed EU investment heading the other way. And at the same time, this investment was not greenfield investment. It wasn't creating new factories and new sales representatives here in Europe, but brownfield investment, acquisitions, buying European companies. And this was very different compared to the EU's other main investors, the U.S., Canada, Switzerland, which are focusing often more on greenfield investments, which often produce more jobs and growth within the countries they're invested in. So China was focused on acquisitions, and its acquisitions tended to be oriented towards advanced manufacturing, tech companies that were part of a new industrial policy called Made in China 2025. And the third point was that while this was going on, there continued to be a lack of market reciprocity between the EU and China. European companies couldn't invest in China as China could invest here. And this really set the tone over the last 3 or 4 years, led to this EU-China strategic outlook, which designated China as an economic partner, but also a strategic competitor and systematic rival. And this wasn't just a policy statement. There were real actions taken because of these sentiments. The EU launched an investment screening mechanism. It's exploring anti-subsidy rules to try to balance the competition between Chinese companies here in Europe and local companies. And Germany and other countries within the EU also raised national barriers on foreign investment, with China largely on the mind. And they've even blocked several Chinese acquisitions of late. So the recent investment deal, if it's ratified in the coming year and a half, it may ease restrictions on EU businesses in China, but it has to be, it needs to be, after it's ratified, it also needs to be implemented, and there also needs to be strong enforcement of it. And we've seen in the past that China has had a tendency to open and close sectors, such as the telecom industry, over time, according to its own interests. And as its competition builds up, then it tends to let in foreign investors. What I think the EU also needs to recognize is that its economic dependency on China is not as strong as is often claimed. So European officials often boast that they trade 1.7 billion euros with China each day. And this is, has led to strong growth. Here we see China's trade growth over the last decade or so, alongside the US. But the reality is that the EU trades $30 billion in goods every day. And much of that is internal trade. In fact, China only represents 5% of total EU trade, if you include internal trade as well. And you see it gets sort of lost in this among the other foreign partners, and intra-EU trade is significant, making up close to 60% of the EU's total trade. What's remarkable here is even Germany, China's largest trading partner within the EU, doesn't have a China dependency. It has a very diverse trade portfolio. So in 2019, China represented 8.5% of Germany's trade in goods, but the US, the Netherlands, France we're not very far behind. This is a diverse trade portfolio, and it's one that doesn't include services, which will push up the importance of particularly Germany's partners here in Europe, but also the United States more significantly. Even where growth is concerned, so just new euros from trade, the EU is quite dominant for Germany, representing 63% of Germany's trade growth from 2015 to 2019. So what makes the difference, I think, on policy thinking is that there are, significant German and other European companies that have higher dependencies, more real dependencies on China. Some of the top German companies have an average of 15% of their sales in China. But at the same time, we need to recognize that corporate interests do not always advance national interests. Companies may be betting big on China, but their activities there, particularly when they say they're investing in China for the domestic market, their activities in China don't necessarily bring welfare or large levels of welfare back to European countries. So even the Federation of German Industries estimates that only 2% of jobs generated from trade are with China. And companies like Volkswagen have said clearly that they reinvest their earnings in China back into the Chinese market. So that we have to, I think, as researchers, but also policymakers, try to make these connections between how European investment in China comes back and helps European welfare, because often foreign investment can be a substitute for exports and undermine jobs back in the home economies of these multinational corporations. We also see, despite the corporate interest, lasting corporate interest in China, there is still, European disillusionment. The 17+1 group of Central and Eastern European countries seemingly today has become a 16+1 group with Lithuania pulling out. And this, some may point the finger at Washington, but these countries have also indicated that they're not seeing trade and investment benefits from engaging with China in this cooperation group. They don't want loans, they want trade, they want market access and investment from the Chinese side. And despite the investment deal, Germany and other member states are still keen on working on WTO reform with other international partners, including the US, Japan, Canada. So lastly, I want to look at how are China's neighbors in Asia responding to its rise? Is the US behind the development of an Asian NATO that is, intention is to contain China? This is a suggestion that Chinese officials, including Foreign Minister Wang Yi, often make when commenting on the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, a grouping of the United States, Japan, India, and Australia. But again, this is a myth. China's large neighbors have had their own reasons to become more cautious towards China. They do not need American direction. Japan represents a first mover. The economic rise of China in recent decades, coupled with military tensions between Japan and China in the East China Sea, has promoted Japan to reach across Asia in search of new sources of economic growth, but also new defense partners. Already in 2007, then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe visited New Delhi seeking to foster a closer relationship with India. This was well before Trump. This was even before Xi Jinping came into power. And when President Trump pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership early in his term as president, Abe kept the agreement alive and got the remaining 11 members to sign it by 2018. And on defense, Japan has continued to solidify its partnership with India. They have a 2+2 foreign ministerial dialogue, and they can now access one another's military bases overseas. For India, recent fighting with China on its Himalayan border has pushed New Delhi to loosen its previous hesitations towards engaging in the Quad, in the security partnership. And New Delhi has also banned dozens of Chinese apps, including TikTok. It's moving in the direction of restricting or even potentially blocking Huawei, the Chinese telecom giant, from engaging in its 5th generation mobile communication networks. And this really comes out of growing tensions with China, particularly the border fighting, and raises the question of how China expects to be a global leader in technologies when it doesn't have India's 1.35 billion population on board. Even in Southeast Asia, which is often known as China's backyard, there's a diversity of power. China is, of course, the largest trading partner, but the US remains ASEAN, the region's largest investor. Japan is the largest provider of finance. And there are sentiments in Southeast Asia to engage with the Quad in order to balance and hedge relations from China. And we often hear about the negative perceptions that have grown increasingly in North America and Europe. But even in Asia, positive sentiment towards China has dropped significantly in the past 2 decades. And this is a consequence, these are countries that really know China well. They've welcomed China's prosperity in recent decades, but they now have grown suspicious of Chinese investment and fearful of Chinese military might. So I hope that I've shown that China's relations, China's rise will be dictated by relations with a broader set of powers and countries than simply the United States. And neither should we assume that China's rise to the commanding heights of the global economy and global affairs is inevitable. China wields considerable power, and I think it will continue to do so, but not dominant power. And Chinese leadership, the decisions they take, ultimately affect the influence they have around the world. This is not leading us into a resurgence of the US, but rather demonstrating the limitations that China has overseas. And I hope, I've shown also that there's a diversity of power in the world today, that Belt and Road countries have concerns with development, not necessarily with debt traps, and that Europe needs to focus on its own competitiveness and innovation rather than believing it's dependent on China's market. And finally, that there's no strong China versus the West divide. China's Asian neighbors also have their concerns with China's behavior. And finally, that leaders in New Delhi or Tokyo, Berlin, can have recognized these challenges with China, but they need to continue to respond and to respond collectively in order to revitalize multilateralism. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Luke, for this introduction. Again, everybody, please start putting your questions into the Q&A tab. I can see there are already some here, but I will abuse my privilege as moderator to start with a couple of questions. So you, in your talk and also in your book, you make a big important point that actual dependence is actually not, like, the real dependence often isn't as high as we think it is on the Chinese market, and also that in countries like Germany, but also you give examples of Denmark, it's often concentrated in a few large enterprises that actually are somewhat dependent more than others. But I guess my question is, doesn't this kind of perception also matter? Because I feel like it's really mattered a lot, and more importantly, what can we do to push back more effectively against this perception of absolute dependence on China, and how can we deal with large influential companies that don't necessarily represent our interests, but still have a lot of political weight in shaping some of these companies? Anyways, how should we deal with that? What's the best way here?
Well, it's certainly difficult to sort of to break through this narrative, I think, that's being created over since the 1990s, over the last several decades. And I try to sort of draw on economic sociology and this idea that there's these economies of anticipation that have built up in Europe and elsewhere towards China, and that political and corporate elites have built up this idea that the Chinese market will forever grow, and our earnings, foreign earnings within the Chinese market will do the same. Whereas the reality is the Chinese market may be growing, but because of a lack of access or unfavorable conditions, growth for even large corporations, but particularly trade, is not guaranteed. And in order, I think, to break down this myth, it requires research. And there have been scholars in Germany in particular, but also elsewhere, that have started to unpack the realities of Europe's economic relations more clearly. I think, China scholars, of course, are focused on China and the growth and China scholars in economics are focused on the growth that has appeared there. And it has been strong growth. But it doesn't undermine the basis that even major European companies like Volkswagen, like Daimler, their sales are still anchored in European markets. And I think, to a certain degree, this narrative has been built up by European managers in China, because we are hearing more critical voices among CEOs in home offices here in Europe, that they get that China is also a competitor, and that they have been pushing more for European policymakers to help level the playing field. But I think, in order to sort of challenge this what I see as a false narrative, it takes research. It also takes thoughtful journalism. I mean, journalists have been critical for all of us understanding China, particularly those based in China. But I often come across, phrases such as, China is by far Europe's or Germany's largest trading partner. We often count the sales of German automakers by the number of vehicles and not by the value, the revenues they generate, because often companies are selling, higher priced cars in Europe compared to China. So we really need to change the framing, and that comes, I think, from solid research.
Yeah, maybe another question of how to better deal with all of this. You write at the beginning, I mean, your title is How China Loses, but of course, the book is about more than that. And you write at the beginning of your conclusion that the world cannot afford for China to lose because it is too important. And a China that is weakened is actually, dangerous more dangerous. And then, a China that doesn't really have these political and economic problems. So if you could lay out a little bit of what individual, what can be done to prevent this from happening. I mean, I know this is a huge topic, but just lay out a couple of your top recommendations of what you think we should do to prevent, relations from unraveling and things from getting worse.
Well, it's obviously a tricky balance to hold because, there's no, I think, sense in pushing a decoupling agenda from China, nor I think is it feasible, nor do I think many have made that argument, particularly since the Trump administration left the White House. But I think it's about sort of finding the areas where European interests and values and foreign interests and values towards China, where there needs to be competition. This could be on tech standards, but also creating deterrences towards China's military assertiveness in Asia. But of course, there are areas where it's essential to work with China on climate change. But at the same time, we shouldn't believe that we should be held hostage by the necessity to work with China on climate change. China also cares, I think, about the future of the climate. It also at least understands the consequences of failing to address climate change. So listen, it's a tricky balance, and I sort of put forward 3 recommendations in the book. One is to continue to partner with China where possible. This could be on global issues like climate change, but it could also be at the embassy level, such as the U.S. and China did in West Africa with the Ebola outbreak there. It could be through the UN and other multilateral forums, such as with anti-piracy efforts off the Horn of Africa. And there are still those possibilities. But I think, because of China's size and strength, it's necessary for countries to beware of the bilateral with China, because that's where it can really leverage its interests and to seek out new partnerships. And I think, we are seeing this in the development of the Quad of late. We're seeing this, that EU has taken a more defensive approach to China, but perhaps has not yet explored what it can do offensively to defend its interests and values in the world. And finally, China is a significant economic actor in the world. It can leverage individual countries through trade pressure, through economic coercion. So it's necessary, I think, for policymakers to understand their economic relationship with China and to understand which sectors of its economy are actually dependent and which ones aren't. And it's important for us to recognize that China has economic interests too that it doesn't want to upset, and that generally with its economic coercion of late against Australia or Canada, or before against South Korea, it tends to only selectively pick companies or sectors to put pressure on in hopes that that will shape the policy of the country in question. And even with Australia, a country heavily dependent on China, 30–40% of its exports heading to the Chinese market. Even there, the pressure China put on was still quite selective, despite there being an array of products. Some of those products, such as coal, were able to find new markets. Others, of course, were hurt, like wine, like lobsters. But Australia overall has survived quite well in terms of its trade relationship, also with China. The same is the case with Canada. So it's about, I think, firstly, trying to tear down these stereotypes that we've built up towards China, and working with others to really push forward new international rules in the WTO, for example, on this type of economic coercion that China and others have used. So it's about sort of, I think, if I take it from a European perspective, or a Canadian one, or an Australian one, or a Japanese one, it's about building international rules rather than choosing between the US and China, to understand that it's not a simple bilateral choice. It's about building multilateral rules over time and spending the time to do it. I mean, Europe spent 7 years on this EU-China investment deal. It could have spent 7 years working on WTO reform. And going forward, that needs to be the focus, I think, on these broader multilateral rules.
Thanks. One last question before I open up the floor to Q&A from everybody joining us today. What do you make of the recent sanctions announced by the EU on Chinese officials tied to Xinjiang and the Bingtuan, the paramilitary organization in the region, and the countersection? Like, what would be your interpretation of what is happening there, and what do you think, how this is going to pan out? I mean, obviously we don't want you to have to predict the future, but I just want to get your general take on what's been going on in particular this week.
I think that the counter sanctions that China made against EU members of parliament, that I think could have been expected from the EU as a response to the EU's move. expanding those sanctions on European research institutes and individual researchers, I think, is an escalation. And I at least, anecdotally, I see China in its responses to these types of pressures, such as in the Meng Wanzhou case, the Huawei executive that is under house arrest in Canada because of an American warrant for her arrest, that China, like more often, is escalating in a response. So, for example, detaining 2 Canadians. So the EU, the condition now, I think, is that it's doing this again. It's doing this to demonstrate to a domestic audience that it's going to protect its political red lines, but it's also doing it to signal to a broader international audience in Asia and around the world not to follow in the EU's footsteps in sanctioning Chinese officials. But at the same time, it's still early days, but it seems to be, because it's targeted at researchers and institutions that weren't necessarily heavily involved on a day-to-day basis on researching the Xinjiang issue. It seems that China is more broadly sending a warning signal to researchers in Europe and elsewhere about sort of conducting independent research on China that may have critical findings. And those that were targeted tended to be institutions, at least from my perspective, that often focused on strategic and economic issues, and that those seem to be areas where China would not appreciate that European policymakers had that sort of thinking behind their decision-making.
Yeah, full disclosure, my former employer, Merix, was among those sanctioned, and I got an honorable mention in the Global Times as one of the people who had this coming. But I want to move to questions from the audience. So we have one on vaccine diplomacy. It says, the FT read an interesting story today suggesting that China's exports and gifts of coronavirus vaccines to developing countries are running into difficulties and mistrust. How important an element of its global ambitions is Beijing's vaccine diplomacy?
It's a good question. I mean, it's again an issue that is still, unraveling. Certainly, where in countries and regions such as Africa, where there are no vaccinations on offer from any country or any international program, this opens room for China to improve its diplomatic ties with host countries. That being said, there's, I think, similar to the mass diplomacy, there's more sort of smoke than fire. There's a lot of promotion to the vaccine diplomacy when we're seeing, as I think the FT article related, high costs to the vaccinations being sold to countries, questions over the reliability, given that these haven't went through all the clinical trials, or at least we don't have transparency on them as we do with other vaccinations. And I think, we are starting to see the international program COVAX kick in. We're starting to see the United States, along with partners within the Quad, India, Japan, and Australia, present a vaccination program, at least for Southeast Asia, providing 1 billion doses there. And as the US, I think, vaccinates its own population, that those kind of programs will likely expand. So in the short term, there are some, I think, diplomatic gains for China, because it was the first out of the gate, because how successful it was in containing the coronavirus at home. But in, I think, the mid to long term, the international community, but also other major powers, are demonstrating their own significance, and the science of particularly the US and European vaccinations has demonstrated to be quite strong.
Yeah, thanks. We have more questions coming in on recent events, one on Myanmar, and that is how you interpret things like the burning of some 30 Chinese-owned garment factories near Yangon and other the other involvement of, the China-Myanmar link and the strong backlash among the protesters against China?
Sure. I don't delve into Myanmar too deeply in the book, but it's another case of sort of conflict resolution that China's gotten involved in. And of course, it has a close relationship with the regime in Myanmar, and that naturally has led to Myanmarese painting China as sort of the foreign partner to what they see as an illegitimate military regime. And these are going to be challenges that China faces in as its investments, but its infrastructure projects expand in the world. I mean, I touch on South Sudan in the book, but Pakistan is another example of regions where there can be conflict and instability that upset Chinese interests. And what's key here is that China hasn't demonstrated a great openness to international cooperation in some of these conflict settings. Certainly, the onus is also on the United States, and in South Sudan, for example, I think the leading diplomats on the Chinese and the American side were eager to work together, including with their EU counterparts. But I think tensions in Washington and Beijing didn't help. They prohibited a lot of close cooperation. But China seems to want to go it alone at the same time, and sort of have a parallel process of being involved in multilateral efforts to end conflicts, but also have its own sort of separate parallel process directly with governments. And without this sort of multilateral cooperation, close cooperation and coordination, China, I think, will discover that its interests in countries like Myanmar, South Sudan, Pakistan will continue to face these risks moving forward.
Thanks. So I'm going to start grouping some questions so we can get through as many as possible of them. So one question is, can you speak about how China builds legitimacy for its foreign policy and how you see its legitimating strategy involvement and evolving? So have you seen any changes in that? And there's another two questions that came about basically the China-Russia link and whether a China-Russia linkage in Asia could try to reduce Western leverage on the continent, and whether a China-Russia arrangement could also, help these countries get around, things like the SWIFT system by having self-sustained financing and economic activities. How do you interpret that?
I think, China's, the strongest point in its legitimacy towards at least developing countries is its success at home. African officials I met in Beijing in researching the book really, looked at their surroundings, particularly in Beijing, as proof that China has succeeded, and that they can perhaps follow its model to have similar success. China has, or Xi Jinping has said, he sees China as an example that other countries can follow, new options for development without losing their independence. But this runs into trouble when, as I indicated, when the fruits of what China is giving often head back home, when infrastructure projects are dominated by Chinese companies, when the benefits of those projects are either don't pan out or are again used by Chinese companies to bring in their own exports into regional markets. So I think at the moment, China's legitimacy is quite strong in the developing world. But at the same time, for example, a recent poll across around 17 African countries, even after 4 years of Donald Trump, still signified as the U.S. as the model they would like to follow. So China faces, I think, legitimacy challenges because of the nature of its finance that it offers, because developing countries aren't getting much trade access for their products back in China, but also because, particularly in democracies, people are witnessing what's going on in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. So yeah, the short term I think is strong for legitimacy. Longer term, I'm more critical. China, Russia is not something I delve into too deeply, but it's certainly something, a partnership to watch moving forward. I think both Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping have an axe to grind against the United States and the West, and that they are working together where they can. Russia has become a significant energy supplier to China. It's I think there's sort of Russia plays more of a junior role in the relationship, but it can prove effective. I think if we look at sort of particularly when the U.S. and the EU are not on side on issues, and Syria is a good example of that. But definitely something to look at moving forward.
Yeah, thanks. I definitely get asked about Russia and China a lot, so it's also not something I've looked at, but it's definitely something to watch more, I guess. We have one question, actually one practical question, whether you will post your slides, to which I can answer. I mean, we will be sending around a link to today's presentation, and it's in there. For everything else I can't, but that would also cover that, so that you can review some of the slides here. For everything else, I'd leave that to you to answer. But maybe one more question. So with the disillusionment with China in Eastern Europe, Eastern Europeans are increasingly discovering that Asian partners are increasingly discovering other Asian partners who have invested much more than China, Japan and South Korea, but even, Singapore and Taiwan. The question continues. Japan has recently here in Budapest sponsored events to highlight non-Chinese investment from Asia in the region. And the question is, how will China react? Do you expect an increase in investments or other activities in Eastern Europe? Or do you more expect that China will withdraw and lose interest in the region, or anything in between?
Firstly, Japanese actions are something that Europe and even the United States can learn a lot from. The Japanese don't necessarily release strongly worded statements, but they act. They, when Xi Jinping last visited Europe, he went to Italy, for example. Shinzo Abe was shortly after that was right behind him, and also visited Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe, and try to solidify ties there as well. Japan was very early on thinking about a China +1 strategy, meaning to diversify some of its investment and trade between China and Southeast Asia back in 2007, 2008, well before Europe and the U.S. were realizing the competitiveness of Chinese companies. So what next for China in Central and Eastern Europe? I mean, it's important to recognize that China is not a monolith, that its companies too are drawn towards trade and investment, good trade and investment possibilities. I think the onus is on the EU to make more of its the diversity of economies that are within the Union. That there is a budding manufacturing base within Central and Eastern Europe that can be further developed, and that would be anchored within Europe, so that we don't see a future where fully made automobiles are being exported from China to Europe. That we keep manufacturing not only in Western Europe but increasingly in Eastern and Central Europe, and that there are sort of cost advantages to doing that. So I don't expect a strong China push because of sort of the limitations that China sees for opportunities, to be frank, in Central and Eastern Europe. That being said, the opportunities are greater for EU investors because of the close proximity, and we're seeing a global economy that is, where trade within regions, within Asia, within Europe, within North America is growing faster than trade between regions. And this is also, I think, something central for European policymakers to understand, that the competitiveness needs to come from within. Operating in China is not going to be the biggest boost towards one's competitiveness and innovation. That will come from activities here in the European Union.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'll group a couple more questions. So one is, much of the narrative to build a coalition of the willing to level the playing field is also linked to the distinction between democracy and authoritarian countries. So with nationalism and authoritarianism on the rise worldwide, what impact do you think this will have for how countries respond, not just to China, but also any emerging coalitions of like-minded countries or calls for these? And another question that was posed was a question of whether you really think, with China as an authoritarian country that is increasingly doesn't want to follow the rules of the current global order, and of course comes in with an agenda to reshape some of that. Are you optimistic about the possibility of winning by, as it says, talking with China? So how much can talks and cooperation with China really achieve under the current circumstances, and with the relatively clear agenda coming out of China that, yeah, the rules need to be reshaped to make them safer for the Chinese Communist Party itself?
Excellent questions. I think, first of all, coalitions, of course, the Quad is made up of democracies, but there are also, governments that aren't full-fledged democracies that are, keen to have clear international rules. That, a country like Vietnam, for example, it wants to have sort of clear international rules, clear maritime sovereignty rules, clear trade rules. And so I wouldn't necessarily, see the world as sharply divided between, heading in that direction, divided between democracies and authoritarian governments, because democracies also have problems with one another, and authoritarian governments also have problems with one another. So how the world will respond to these coalitions? Well, it depends on, I think, how the U.S. or India or other sort of major powers frame these coalitions. And I think we need to see a framing, again, I repeat it, but a framing towards developing international rules for all, and not a framing, sort of an anti-China framing that we often still hear, although at a different tone coming out of Washington. Yes. The second question, does it make sense to talk to China? It's important to keep talking, because if we're not talking, I think if we lose our understanding of one another, and unfortunately this is where things may be headed, as journalists are sent out of, foreign journalists are sent out of China, as researchers aren't able to access China in the future. But I think China still is, as I said, concerned with its own economic growth, and it's not at a stage where it's self-sufficient. We often hear that China is a technological superpower. Of course, it has become much more competitive in different tech areas, such as AI, such as 5G mobile communications, but it's still, not a leader in technology. It's still sort of ranked, underneath the top 10 in many tech areas. So it's important to recognize that China needs the world, and the world needs China, certainly, for its marketplace, for the fact that it's so significant to issues such as climate change. But to not believe the propaganda coming out of Beijing that it can sort of dictate the behavior of other countries. I think the economic coercion acts that China has taken in recent years demonstrate that it's still sensitive to its own economic growth. It's still sensitive to these relationships. It still needs to access natural resources, needs to access technology from others. So a grouping or of countries that work on developing new international rules, which will have Chinese input, it will, I think, gain traction. But we need to move past the idea that China is sort of inevitably going to become the dominant superpower.
Yeah, thank you. We are unfortunately out of time, and I want to be mindful of everybody's time. So apologies to everyone whose questions I haven't been able to get to. A big thank you to everybody joining us here today. And of course, the biggest thank you to Dr. Luke Patey for joining us here today to talk about his new book, which is out, How China Loses. Thanks again so much, and see you next time.
Thanks so much.